Hello student, welcome to the lecture on elasticity of demand and supply, and after this lecture, you will be able to learn the following objectives. Give details of the meaning of price elasticity of demand. Give details of the classification of demand curves according to their price elasticity. Describe the types of elasticity of demand. Talk about the elasticity of demand with respect to advertisement.
Chapter 5 Managerial Economics Meaning of Price Elasticity of Demand. What it shows. Elasticity of demand measures how responsive a product's demand is to change in its price level. Demand for luxury products vary greatly dependent on the price. For example, innocent smoothies. People will pay highly for necessities regardless of price. For example, water. Let's clarify this with the help of graphs. Here two graphs are shown. One is elastic demand, another is inelastic demand. Difference between two is when price changes in elastic demand graph, then quantity also changes on huge scale. However, in inelastic demand, when price change, there is only small effect happening over the quantity demand.
For example, when we're talking about a demand curve, we'd like to know how responsive quantity demanded is to things like price. So we have a number of options. The most obvious of the options is just to think about the slope of the demand curve. And the slope of the demand curve, as we said before, is just equal to the change in price divided by the change in quantity. So this is one option. It's not quite as intuitive as we would like because it really answers the question, what is the responsiveness of market prices in terms of a 1 unit change in quantity demanded? That's a little strange. So what if we just flip this guy upside down and we could say, well, let's just take the reciprocal of the slope of the demand curve, and then we get change in quantity divided by the change in price. So this answers the question, for 1 unit change in price, say $1 for example, by how much does the quantity demanded change? So we're at least on the right track here, but it's still a little bit strange because we want something that really can be used to compare across markets and to say, well, what markets are actually more responsive than others? It would be sort of strange to compare a $1 increase or decrease in the price of an apple to a $1 increase or decrease in the price of a Boeing 747. So people clearly don't really think about those the same way, so we need some way to take that sort of comparability into account. To quantify responsiveness of quantity demanded to price, we use what's called price elasticity of demand. We'll come back in a little bit and talk about other types of elasticities, but we'll focus on this one for now as an example. The price elasticity of demand is represented not by the absolute change in quantity demanded divided by the absolute change in price, but in terms of the relative change in quantity demanded divided by the relative change in price. Or, mathematically put, just percent change in quantity divided by percent change in price. Let's think about what this really means mathematically. Now, you see here as a refresher, we have our formulas for percent change. And the percent change in quantity demanded is just the new quantity demanded minus the old quantity demanded divided by the old quantity demanded times 100%. We can write that a little bit more simply as just the change in quantity demanded divided by quantity demanded times 100%. We can do the same thing with price. So the percent change in price is just the new price minus the old price divided by the old price times 100%. Or alternatively, change in P divided by P times 100%. Now when we put that together and say, well, what does this elasticity of demand really come out to? We can just plug in the formulas for percent change, and we notice that doing a little bit of algebra, we end up with change in quantity demanded divided by change in price which is the reciprocal, the slope of this demand curve here, but it's scaled by the ratio of price to quantity. So it is related to the slope of the demand curve, or rather the reciprocal, but it's off by this factor here. You'll notice here that I made a minor change to the elasticity formula, and I put the absolute value signs around this percentage change formula. The reason that I do that is because for price elasticity of demand, you usually see it written as a positive number, whereas if you think about it, quantity demanded and price move in opposite directions, as we can see from the fact that the demand curve slopes downwards, and we would actually always get a negative number here. And since we always get a negative number, it's easier to just represent it as the absolute value of that quantity. You'll notice that we do this only for price elasticity of demand and not for other types of demand, because for other types of demand, the sign positive or negative actually conveys information. The other thing to note about elasticity is that there are no units on this quantity, because if you were to write out all the units, they would end up canceling out. So we can say that elasticity, whether it be price elasticity of demand or other elasticities that we'll talk about, they're just pure numbers and they don't have any units. Now, to illustrate why it's so important to think about elasticity at a particular point on the demand curve, let's contrast a constant slope demand curve, which we all know is a straight line, to a constant elasticity demand curve. Now, the math here isn't so important, but what's important to remember is the constant elasticity demand curve is not a straight line, and it is in fact bowed in towards the origin. Now, because we usually deal with demand curves that look something like this, we're going to need to be sure to say from and to what point we're talking about when we refer to elasticity of demand. Now, in order to illustrate what happens to elasticity of demand as we move down our demand curve, let's consider this particular example. I've drawn a very simple demand curve with a slope of -1, and the slope is -1 regardless of where we are on the curve. But I've also noted a number of points here, so let's think about what the elasticity looks like at each of these points. Now you can see over here, we can move down the demand curve from a price of 10 to 9, 9 to 8, 8 to 7, etc. And this corresponds to moving down in this direction. As our price goes down, our quantity goes up. And for each of these, we can calculate the percent change in price and the percent change in quantity. So as we go from 10 to 9 on price, that's a decrease in price of 10%. So we go from 9 to 8, it's a decrease of 11%. 8 to 7 is a decrease of 12.5%. 3 to 2 is a decrease of 33%. 2 to 1 is a decrease of 50%. 1 to 0 is a decrease of 100%. Correspondingly, we can see the percent increases in quantity. Well, as we go from 0 to 1, well, that's actually an infinite percent increase. So we go from 1 to 2, that's a 100% increase. 2 to 3 is a 50% increase. 7 to 8 is a 14% increase. 8 to 9 is a 12.5% increase. And 9 to 10 is an 11% increase. Notice here that we're either increasing or decreasing by 1 unit each time, but they translate to smaller percentages when the numbers that we're talking about are bigger. So we know that the elasticity of demand is equal to the percent change in quantity divided by the percent change in price, so we can go ahead and calculate that for each of these points. Well, infinity divided by -10%, well, that's just infinite. And if you remember, we always take the absolute value when we're talking about elasticity of demand. So here, the elasticity of demand is in fact infinite. Moving down to this point here, we get 100% divided by -11%. Take the absolute value of that, and we get about 9. The absolute value of 50% divided by 12.5% is 4. The absolute value of 14% divided by 33% is about 0.42. The absolute value of 12.5% divided by 50% Well, that's 0.25 or 1/4. And finally, 11% divided by 100% in absolute value terms, this is about 0.11. So you'll notice that even though we were talking about a 1 unit increase and decrease each time, that translates to a number of different values for elasticity. If we plot the elasticity numbers where they go on our graph, you'll notice that as we move down the demand curve, our elasticity numbers get smaller. At the top left here, we have a point where our elasticity is what we call perfectly elastic, or we get an elasticity of demand of infinity. As we move down to the bottom right, we get to a point where our demand is perfectly inelastic, or in other words, our elasticity of demand is equal to 0.
Nature of demand curves and elasticity. In some cases, however, the elasticity remains the same throughout the length of the demand curve. Such demand curves can be placed in the following categories: perfectly inelastic, unitary elastic, perfectly elastic, slope of the demand curve and price elasticity. The elasticity of a demand curve is often judged by its appearance. The flatter the demand curve, the greater the elasticity, and vice versa. But this conclusion is misleading because two demand curves with different slopes may have the same elasticity at a given price. Types of elasticities of demand. There are three types of elasticity of demand: price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand.
Elasticity concept. In particular, we start with the price elasticity of demand. It's the big one. Once we understand that, the others are relatively easy to follow. The price elasticity of demand. My symbol for that up here is the E with a subscript D on it. Price elasticity of demand. Conceptually, what we're talking about is how much importance does the price play in the buyer's decision to buy. In other words, is price really important, or it really doesn't matter, I'm going to buy it anyway? If price is really important in the buying decision, it could be that a small increase in the price and the buyer says, never mind, I don't want it. Or a small decrease in the price, the buyer might say, hey, that's great, I'd like a lot more. In that case, price is pretty important. Alternatively, there are times when the price is not terribly relevant, at least within a range, when we might say, I don't care what it costs, I need it now. Now what we're talking about is the elasticity or price elasticity of demand. Think about this. If gasoline escalates up by 10 or 15 cents a gallon, does that change people's driving habits? Typically, no. The price isn't terribly relevant to their decision on how much to buy. That sort of demand, where the price doesn't play a big role, we call an inelastic demand. When we say your demand for a product is inelastic, we mean you're willing to pay considerably more for it just to keep buying about as much as you have been. So in an inelastic demand, if you want to think of it this way, you really need it. Okay? An elastic demand, on the other hand, means that even a rather small increase in the price would cause you to buy something else or not buy that product. So let's take a look. What makes the demand for a product or a service become more elastic or more inelastic? Just conceptually. And there are four factors we want to discuss. The first one, is the product or service a necessity, or is it a luxury? Something you don't really need to have. If it's a necessity, how important is the price? If you need it bad. If you're out of gas, you need gasoline. If you're dying of thirst and you need water. If you're a diabetic and you need insulin. Those are necessities. We know that when the demand for a product is a necessity, then we know the demand is going to be fairly inelastic. Let's look at what that means. That means on the demand curve that even though the price may change quite a bit, the quantity people purchase changes very little. The price is not terribly important when you have a necessity at issue. On the other hand, if you're selling luxuries or products that people don't terribly have to have, it may be that a relatively small drop in price encourages them to buy a lot more, or a relatively small increase in price discourages them, causes them to buy considerably less. In that case, the demand curve is going to be relatively flat. More to the shape of the demand curves in a minute. So, necessities have inelastic demand. Luxuries have a more elastic demand. What else? If there are very few substitutes for the product, how many substitutes do you know for insulin or for gasoline when you're out of gas? If there are very few substitutes for the product, the demand tends to be very inelastic. On the other hand, if there are a lot of substitutes, then the price of that product goes up, we buy something else, easily substitutable. Okay? If the price of Colgate toothpaste goes up, we buy Crest or whatever. All right? Plenty of substitutes for a particular brand name especially. Think about this one. Suppose the price of Miller beer went up. What would happen to the sales of Miller beer? Well, people would look around and say, well, I can buy a lot of other different beers out there, so a small increase in the price of Miller beer might cause people to abandon it and go buy another brand of beer immediately. Okay? Finally, or third, if there is very little time for you to make your purchase, very little time to shop around, to compare, if you need it and you need it right now, your demand tends to be more inelastic. That's how convenience stores make their living. People would rather run inside, buy something quick, and run back out than go in and take their time going through a grocery store. So you can literally find a grocery store and a convenience store, both of them selling beer. And the convenience store selling it at a much higher price because people are willing to pay the greater price because they're in a hurry, because they want the convenience of in and out real quick. If you have plenty of time to shop, your demand tends to be more elastic. The price becomes a bigger consideration. If your car breaks down, you need a car right now. Your demand gets to be inelastic. If you're planning in the future and you're saying, I'm not going to buy a car until about 6 months from now, I've got plenty of time to look around, then you're much more sensitive to what prices are. Make sense? And then finally, if the product or service you're
Income elasticity of demand.
A large part of your budget, a large percentage of your income, your demand tends to be pretty inelastic. That would mean that when you're buying a car, if the price goes up 10%, that's quite a bit of money, because that's a lot of your budget. But if you're out there buying something small, like a box of toothpicks or a box of salt, an increase in the price of that, because it costs very little anyway, a 10% increase in the price, doesn't make much of a difference in your budget. It accounts for a small part of your budget, and so your demand tends to be inelastic for things that are a small part of your expenditures, and much more elastic for products that account for a large percent of your budget. You want to keep these factors in mind. There's a few lessons to be learned in there. If, for example, you're going out to a job interview, do you want the demand for you and your services to be inelastic or elastic? If it's inelastic, it means you hopefully will command a greater price. So, for example, can you prove to me when you come to my company to interview for a job, are you truly a necessity? Is there something about you I need to have? Are there very few substitutes for you? Are you unique in your skills, your talents, your experiences, your motivation, etc.? Do I need to hire somebody in a hurry? And are you going to account for only a small part of my total payroll? In those cases, you've got a better chance of starting off at a better salary. So this is another way to look at how bad do people want it, or how bad do they want you. Okay, that's the introduction to the price elasticity of demand. Next, we're going to get into some of the calculations and visualizations. Thanks.
Elasticity of demand is a measurement of the responsiveness of demand for a good when there's a change in income, not a change in price. The price of the good is irrelevant here. It's when our income changes, because of course our demand for goods is affected by many things. Our demand for goods is not just affected by the goods price, it's affected by our income. The demand for a good is affected by fashions, laws, the weather, the size of a population, advertising, the prices of other goods, and so on. All kinds of factors impact on the demand for a good. And a major one is income. When our income changes, the demand we have for certain goods will change as well. For most goods, a change in income will lead to a corresponding change in demand in the same direction. If our income goes up, our demand for the good goes up. We call those goods normal goods. But for some goods, the demand for the good changes in the opposite direction to income. If our income rises, our demand for that good would fall. If our income falls, the demand for the good would rise. These goods are called inferior goods. Okay, so let's explore this a little bit. Income elasticity of demand then. The equation for calculating the value of income elasticity of demand for a good is as follows. We use Y for income, of course, because I is reserved for investment. So income elasticity of demand is the income divided by quantity times change in quantity over change in income. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine that my income rises from £100 to £120. Okay? And let's explore what happens to my demand for steak. I like steak. Okay, I like steak, but I just can't afford to buy as much of it as I'd like to buy. When my income, let's draw this as a table. When my income was 100, let's say that the quantity of steak that I was buying was 40. And when my income goes up to 120, I see that the quantity I'm buying is now 60. Let's calculate the value of the YED. Well, Y over Q is 100 divided by quantity 40 times the change in quantity. Well, quantity rose by 20, so 20 divided by the change in income. Well, that's also 20. So 100 over 40 times 20 over 20, if you do the maths, you'll find that that comes to, I hope, 2.5. And it's positive. Okay, in fact, I should have written that equals plus 2.5. There are two things that we can take from this. I need a bit of space, so I'm going to rub out this, these notes here. There are two pieces of information we must analyse when we get a YED reading. We must look at the sign and the size. The sign and the size. Well, the sign is positive. It's plus, it's a positive number, and that tells us it's plus means normal good. That means that the demand changes in the same direction as our income. Income has risen, so has the demand for steak. The size tells us how responsive the demand was, and that's pretty high. That's elastic. It's greater than 1, therefore it's income elastic. In fact, for every 1% change in my income, I got a 2.5% rise in the demand for this good. For every 1% rise in my income, 2.5% rise for the good. But let's imagine that at the same time as my increasing demand for steak, I also used to buy bus tickets. Sorry, it's a boring example, but it's Friday morning and I'm just too tired to think of anything better. So bus tickets. Now let's imagine that when my income was 100, I used to buy 200 bus tickets. But when my income rose to 120, I bought less bus tickets. I only bought 180 bus tickets. I used to, let's say, be able to afford now to treat myself to a taxi ride instead of getting the bus on Friday mornings when I'm very tired. So what does this do to YED? Well, let's work it out again. Y over Q is 100 over 200 times change in Q. Now this is minus 20. Very important we put the minus in. Minus 20 over change in Y. Well, that Y has risen, income has risen by 20. There, look at that now. That calculates to minus 0.5. And that reveals quite a lot. Again, we must look at sign and size. The sign tells us it's inferior. It's an inferior good. The demand for it changes in the opposite direction to our income change. My income rose, my demand fell. Comes out as negative. The 0.5 tells us that it's income inelastic. not very responsive. A 1% change in my income would cause a 0.5% change in my demand for this good. The sign and the size, that's the trick with income elasticity of demand. Sign will tell you, is it normal, is it inferior? Size will tell you the size of the elasticity. Is it income elastic, if it's over 1, if it's income inelastic? Okay, look at those two things separately, the sign and the size. Okay, of course there is another equation. You may not be able to use this equation. You may have to use what I call the percentage equation, which is percent change in quantity divided by percent change in income. Because you might just be told something like, after a 10% rise in income, my demand for bus tickets falls by 20% or something like that, in which case you'll have to work with percentages because you don't have absolute numbers. But the interpretation is exactly the same. Okay, that's income elasticity of demand, how responsive our demand for a good is and in which direction it goes following a change in income. Okay, thanks very much. Cross-elasticity of demand is defined as a measurement of the responsiveness of demand for one good when there is a change in the price of another good. And that matters, of course, because many goods, our demand for them is affected by changes in the price of other goods because they may be a substitute or a complement good. For instance, if I like to play tennis, my demand for tennis balls may be affected by a change in the price of tennis rackets or a change in the price of footballs as an alternative, and so on. So certainly on the A level, paper 1, module 1, how markets work, this comes up quite a lot, and it's a useful thing to remember that our demand for goods is very much affected by the availability and the price of alternative goods in alternative micro markets. So let's go through this. The equation is quite easy. You might think it's difficult, but it's actually quite easy if you know the PED one, because the cross elasticity of demand for good A with respect to B. So it's already looking complicated, but believe me, it isn't. What that means is we're going to measure how responsive is the demand for good A when B changes price. A is the subject of this study. Okay? A, how does its demand change when B changes price? Nothing else is changing. A's price is not changing. Income is not changing. Ceteris paribus, we are just looking at the change in the price of B. Equals, how do we calculate it? Well, it's the old equation, P over Q times change in Q over change in P. But of course, it's the price of good B and the quantities of good A. Okay. Let's work with an example. Let's imagine that A is Coke, Coca-Cola, okay, just put Coke. B is Pepsi. Now, we're going to measure what happens to the demand for Coke when Pepsi changes price. And let's imagine that this was done and we found some research and we found, let's keep it simple, we found that when the price of Pepsi and the quantity of Coke, well, when the price of Pepsi went from 1 to 2, the quantity of Coke bought went from 1,000 to 1,500. Okay, let's work with that. Let's put that into our equation. And we have the price of B. And the price of Pepsi was originally 1, and the quantity of Coke being bought was originally 1,000, times change in quantity, 500, divided by change in the price, which is 1. It went up by 1. And if you work that out, it's 500 over 1,000. It comes out to a half, and it's plus a half. Well, just like with income elasticity of demand, it's really important that you take your value and you look at the sign and the size. Let me make some room again. So we've got this plus a half. Sign, is it plus, is it minus? We know that a plus value on cross elasticity of demand denotes that these goods are substitutes. Now, we might have expected Coke and Pepsi to be substitutes, but we couldn't be sure of it until we analysed the data. And the fact is that when the price of Pepsi goes up, probably there's reduced quantity demand for Pepsi. We're not looking at that. But we see that the rise in price of Pepsi has caused people to buy Coke. Probably what's happening is people are saying, oh, Pepsi's really expensive, don't want to buy Pepsi, I'll go and buy a Coke instead. But we can't be sure of what's going through people's minds, but we can look at the numbers and we can say when the price of Pepsi fell, there was an increase in the quantity demanded, increase in the demand, of Coke, and it was positive and they are substitutes. If it came out negative, we'd have to conclude that the two goods being studied are complements. Now, the number, that's the size, in this case it's a half. Size, with other elasticities, bigger or smaller than 1 is really important. Here we just say, how big is the number? Half is a medium size, quite a strong relationship. You see, the size of the number tells us about the strength of the relationship. The bigger the number, whether it's plus or minus, the bigger the number, the closer the relationship, be it substitute or complement, between the goods. And the smaller the number, the closer to 0, the weaker is that substitute relationship or that complement relationship. So if we were studying the cross-elasticity of demand between carrots and computers, we'd probably find that XED equals 0, no relationship between those goods. A change in the price of carrots doesn't affect our demand for computers. Okay, so like income elasticity of demand, very important you look at sign and size. Size, we just have to ask how far from 0. The further from 0, strong relationship. Near 0, weak relationship. Okay, so there we are. I think that's it. I think I've used enough time. Okay, thanks for watching. Please send me your comments on all the videos. It keeps me going, and tell me what you want to see, because I'm running out of ideas. All right.
Elasticity of demand with respect to advertisement. The advertising elasticity of demand, AED, measures the responsiveness of changes in the quantity demanded to changes in the level of advertising. It is calculated using the following formula: percent change in demand, percent change in advertising expenditure. The calculation of the AED will produce a value. This value will indicate some of the characteristics of the good. For instance, a value over 1 implies a relatively elastic demand. In other words, an increase in the level of advertising will cause a proportionately greater increase in the demand for the good. Factors determining of elasticity of demand. There are several factors which determine the elasticity of demand. For necessaries and conventional necessaries, the demand is inelastic or less elastic. Demand for luxuries is elastic. For substitutes, the demand is also elastic. Demand for goods having several uses is elastic. Demand for goods, the use of which can be postponed, is elastic. Elasticity also depends on the price level. The same commodity may have inelastic demand for certain users and elastic for certain other users. Proportion of total expenditure allocated for the commodity. Habit and fashion. Future expectations about price changes. The state of joint demand. Summary. Planning is deciding in advance what is to be done. It involves the selection of objectives, functions of management policies, procedures and programs from among alternatives. The relative response of a change in quantity demanded to a change in price. A comparable elasticity on the supply side is the price elasticity of supply. The price elasticity of demand is delineated as the degree of responsiveness or sensitiveness of demand for a commodity to the changes in its price. The price elasticity of demand is commonly divided into one of 5 elasticity alternatives: perfectly elastic, relatively elastic, unit elastic, relatively inelastic, and perfectly inelastic, depending on the relative response of quantity to price.